Hello there. Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, Trump the disruptor, tariffs, threats, backdowns and big deals. But will he get his way?
Looks like he's going to get his controversial cabinet picks at least. We're going to hear from a supporter of Kennedy and Gabbard. But first...
President Trump has launched his second trade war in as many weeks, following last week's brief spat with Colombia over military deportation flights. This week's tariff fight with Canada and Mexico also saw an early truce, although China is putting up a bit more of a fight. The opening salvo was fired by Trump, accusing all three of being responsible for America's tens of thousands of annual fentanyl deaths, while also admitting that trade deficits are a consideration. Still, he was denying it was a bluff.
Not a negotiating tool?
No, it's not. No, it's a pure economic. We have big deficits with, as you know, with all three of them. And in one case, they're sending massive amounts of fentanyl, killing hundreds of thousands of people a year with the fentanyl. And in the other two cases, they're making it possible for this poison to get in, number one. And number two, we have big deficits, and it's something we're doing.
Are you though? Really? Trump's executive order imposed 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico and added 10% to existing tariffs on China. A sombre-sounding Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau soon hit back, though, with matching Canadian tariffs on US imports, warning that Americans as well as Canadians would suffer.
If President Trump wants to usher in a new golden age for the United States, the better path is to partner with Canada, not to punish us.
Although Trump is looking for a little bit more than a partnership, he repeated his call for Canada to become part of the United States.
Canada should become our cherished 51st state. Much lower taxes and far better military protection for the people of Canada. And no tariffs.
Meanwhile, Canada's Conservative opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, whose own brand of populism has been compared to Trump's, he condemned the tariffs and he is certainly not for giving away Canada's sovereignty.
There is no justification whatsoever for these tariffs or this treatment. Canada will never be the 51st state. We are an independent, proud, and strong nation.
And the pressure campaign continued, Trump reposting this clip of a Canadian woman who wants him in charge because of transgender sport issues.
I am the grandmother now of two little granddaughters, and if Donald J. Trump were president of my country, at least I wouldn't have to worry about men in their bathrooms. At least I would know that they would have a fair chance if they did decide to go into sports. Come and save us, Donald Trump.
However, actual sports fans in Ottawa made their feelings pretty clear during the singing of the US national anthem before a weekend hockey game. Back in Washington, D.C., and Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer was saying that this is going to hit American consumers hard.
We're now in a trade war with Mexico and Canada. For the American people, it'll now be a war between prices and their paychecks.
And Chuck was even getting some unexpected support from the traditionally conservative American Farm Bureau, whose president, Zippy Duval, expressed alarm, adding, "We know from experience that farmers and rural communities will bear the brunt of retaliation." Zippy also noting over 80% of the United States supply of a key fertiliser ingredient, potash, comes from Canada, and more than 20% of US farm income comes from exports, which are dominated by these three markets. So, the stakes were high on both sides. Mexico was the first to announce an olive branch, sending 10,000 Mexican National Guard troops to the US border to, quote, stop drug trafficking, in return for a 1-month pause on tariffs. Trump then got Trudeau on the phone and soon another deal was announced. The Canadian leader appointing a fentanyl czar. And following Trump's lead in listing cartels as terrorists as a result of that and other border measures, proposed tariffs will be paused for at least 30 days. So, is this just a truce? Is it a peace deal? Time will tell. Meanwhile, Trump has put Europe on notice that they're next for a tariff war. We'll see if these tactics work for a third time, Chaz?
Well, if they even worked the first two times, John, I can't help noticing that many of Mexico and Canada's concessions were just things they'd already given to Biden for free previously. Although, I'm sure the fentanyl czar will have a nice shiny logo.
Yeah.
But I do want to focus on just one thing. How can Trump possibly keep on doing this? I mean, the Constitution clearly empowers Congress to set tariffs, not the President. Congress has partially delegated that power to the President during an emergency, but that's it. And so Trump keeps coming up with these bogus emergencies to justify this one move of his. Now, according to the relevant law, these tariffs are only supposed to be to deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy. Then you can declare an emergency as president. In this case, Trump said the tariffs were to stop the extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs, including fentanyl. That was your national emergency. Fine. Except have you seen the encounter numbers on the southern border the last 12 months? They've dropped right off. And by the way, this month, they've fallen another 95% from that graph. So this is hardly an emergency. As for drug overdose deaths, well, they could hardly be falling faster. That is a very steep drop at the end there. So where is the emergency? And all of this goes double for Canada, where they had fewer than 20,000 migrants intercepted between the border posts in the first 9 months of the last fiscal year. And where last year, customs agents intercepted 19 kilos of fentanyl on the northern border, compared to 9,600 kilos on the southern border. This is not a legitimate emergency in Canada. In fact, Trump isn't even pretending it's a legitimate emergency. He said this on the same day as his declaration.
Mexico and Canada have never been good to us on trade. They've treated us very unfairly on trade, and we will be able to make that up very quickly.
By the way, that doesn't bear scrutiny either. When he says these countries are being unfair to America, he means America has a small trade deficit with them. That's it. But that's just because lots of Americans want to buy their stuff. And by the way, even if their trade was unfair, which it isn't, whose fault would that be? When Trump, remember, in his first term pressured both those countries into signing, quote, the largest, most significant, modern and balanced trade agreement in history. According to Trump, that's the USMCA. So trade unfairness is also a bogus excuse for tariffs, not to mention not an emergency. The bottom line is, for this to stop, someone's got to hold Trump accountable. It clearly isn't going to be Congress, but even on an international level, accountability is in short supply. Back in 2018, Trump was sued for his rather dodgy tariffs on steel and aluminium. And 4 years later, the World Trade Organization delivered their judgment, and Trump lost on every point. So what happened? Well, the Biden administration saved him. They decided to ignore the ruling because, quote, the United States will not cede decision-making over its essential security to the World Trade Organization panels. So that explains why US tariff diplomacy has no guardrails, John. You reap what you sow.
America, we are at war. In the sticky grip of an enemy from the north, the maple Peril. Determined to poison America with cheap energy, the metric system, the pronunciation of a boot, and by being a bit French. Can you identify a Canadian? Most look just like normal humans, but with several key differences. Look out for a strong physique caused by universal health care, sharp fangs dripping in poutine, and a giant bent stick, which we believe is used for making fentanyl in their underground drug labs. If you see a Canadian, do not approach. They will engage you in polite conversation, then probably apologize. With your help, we'll smash this syrupy scourge and liberate America from low prices. M-A-G-A, MAGA.
Just as Donald Trump roiled financial markets with his on-again, off-again tariff announcements this week, he's also thrown a cat amongst the pigeons in the Middle East today. While meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, Trump not only completed his full retreat from his earlier support for a two-state solution with the Palestinians, but he endorsed the long-term relocation of millions of Gazans, pressuring Jordan and Egypt to accept them or else.
I don't think people should be going back to Gaza. I think that Gaza has been very unlucky for them. They've lived like hell. They lived like you're living in hell. Gaza is not a place for people to be living. And the only reason they want to go back, and I believe this strongly, is because they have no alternative. What's the alternative? Go where? There's no other alternative. If they had an alternative, they'd much rather not go back to Gaza and live in a beautiful alternative that's safe.
And Trump then went on to suggest the US could even take over Gaza.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site.
So it seems we're seeing the same playbook now in diplomacy as we've been seeing in tariffs, and we'll see how all of that works out soon enough. Meanwhile, two of Donald Trump's more controversial cabinet picks have cleared major hurdles towards their confirmation by the United States Senate. Tulsi Gabbard, the former Democratic member of Congress and Trump's nominee to become the next Director of National Intelligence, and Robert Kennedy Jr., who's been nominated, of course, to head the Department of Health and Human Services. Both of them winning support of Senate committees today, despite contentious hearings last week. Gabbard has faced criticisms, particularly over her 2017 meeting with the then Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, with former senior intelligence officials and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton describing Gabbard as a Russian asset. Under questioning from Democratic Senator Michael Bennet, Gabbard denied that she takes her talking points from Russian propaganda.
Your own words are in alignment with what the Russians have said to justify their invasion of Ukraine. Yes or
Senator,
no?
I don't pay attention to Russian propaganda.
So
My goal is to speak the truth,
the answer is
regardless of whether you like it or not.
And after reposting that clip, the professional trolls at the Kremlin-funded Russia Today Twitter account then said, "We've got your back, Tulsi."
Maybe they do, but I reckon Gabbard's problem with the Senate coming up might be whose back she has, which is namely mega leaker Edward Snowden. An enormous amount of time at her first hearing was taken up by both Republicans and Democrats demanding that Gabbard call Snowden a traitor. And yet she point blank refused.
Was Edward Snowden a traitor?
Senator, my heart is with my commitment to our Constitution and our nation's security.
Was he a traitor this time when he took America's secrets, released them in public, and then ran to China and became a Russian citizen?
Senator, I'm focused on the future and how we can prevent something like this from happening again.
Is Edward Snowden a traitor to the United States of America? That is not a hard question to answer when the stakes are this high.
Senator, as someone who has
your
served
answer,
in
yes
uniform,
or no, is Edward Snowden a traitor to the United States of America?
as someone who has worn our uniform
in
combat, I understand how critical our national security
Apparently
is.
you don't. Apparently you don't.
Honestly, I reckon it's admirable how stubbornly she stuck to her highly inconvenient guns. I mean, really easy to throw them overboard if she wanted to then. But it could cost her in her Senate vote.
Yeah, the lady is not for turning on Edward Snowden. Meanwhile, Kennedy remains on track to be confirmed, despite concerns that he's a vaccine skeptic and a conspiracy theorist who's flip-flopped on key issues like abortion. One of the Republicans who hasn't been afraid to stand up to Trump until now, North Carolina's Tom Tillis, is all in on Kennedy, explaining his support this way.
I hope he goes wild and actually finds a way to reduce the cost of health care.
For more, I spoke earlier to former Democratic Congressman and two-time presidential candidate Dennis Kucinich, who also managed Bobby Kennedy's presidential campaign in 2023 and was in that same 2017 meeting with Bashar al-Assad as Tulsi Gabbard. He now supports both Gabbard and Kennedy's nominations. I wonder, can you explain to our viewers tuning in, wondering how it is that America is about to nominate as Director of National Intelligence somebody accused of being a Russian asset by a former Director of National Intelligence, a former head of the CIA, and a former Secretary of State? Have you lost your minds?
Well, first of all, the one thing about Tulsi Gabbard is she tells the truth. And I think that's what has attracted President Trump to nominate her for the Director of National Intelligence and to make her the Director of National Intelligence. Any of the others who have entered into this with accusations that question her patriotism, her loyalty, this is just tells you more about them than about Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, she's been serving our country for over 22 years in the Army Reserve. She's a lieutenant colonel. She has top secret clearance. And for them to put a Russia smear on her just kind of explains where they're coming from, not based on the information they have, but on their worldview, which doesn't allow for anyone to be able to offer an approach that, shall we say, is more peaceful, is not manipulative, isn't looking for starting wars, wants to stop the endless wars. So Tulsi Gabbard represents a whole new approach, which is real intelligence, which is based on facts.
One of the pieces of evidence that her critics used to question her patriotism and her alignment with America's national interests is that 2017 meeting with the then Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad. You were at that meeting. What can you tell us about that, the nature of the conversations, and was there anything in retrospect that was inappropriate or misguided about holding that meeting?
Well, first of all, let me explain to you about the United States Constitution. Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and it's a creation of what's called Article 1. Article 1, Section 6, gives Congress the authority and the power to go and inquire about matters of state, which means that Congress, any member of Congress, actually has the ability to go and visit leaders anywhere in order to get information that would help them in making decisions on the legislative process. So she had every right to be there. The fact that she was there without the permission of the State Department is irrelevant. Congress is a separate branch of government. And so that particular journey of hers and of mine was to determine whether or not the United States was using U.S. tax dollars to help finance the work of various terrorist groups that had been aiming at ousting the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And lo and behold, after extensive interviews and investigation, it's exactly what was determined. And so Tulsi Gabbard came back to Congress and put legislation forward, which was sponsored in the Senate by Senator Rand Paul, that said, stop funding terrorists. A few years later, a gentleman by the name of Marco Rubio raised the same question with respect to Afghanistan.
Dennis Kucinich, another friend of yours, is another controversial nominee for a senior cabinet post in the Trump administration, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. You ran his presidential campaign early on. Explain to us how somebody who has been on a podcast saying no vaccine is safe and effective is a safe and effective choice to be Health and Human Services Secretary.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to state, John, for the record, that all of my friends are controversial. And that with respect to Bobby Kennedy, who I've known for more than 30 years, and when he asked me to run his campaign 2 years ago, one of the first questions I asked him, I said, there's all these questions floating around. Are you against vaccines, full stop? He said, no, not at all. You know, he made it very clear that he's for vaccine safety. Now, we had this horrible COVID pandemic, which vaccines were rushed forward without adequate testing, and some people had a reaction to them. And so Kennedy asked these questions that could compromise not the health of people, but the profits of the pharmaceutical companies.
But of course, he's not, Dennis, just raising questions about safety. He is stating that he tells people in the street, don't get your children vaccinated. He has suggested that Lyme disease is a bioweapon. This is not asking questions. This is conspiracy theories.
Well, Kennedy is going to be confirmed. if he hasn't already, as we're speaking. And so will Tulsi Gabbard. And Kennedy's work is going to be to make America healthy again, and he will endeavor to do that. I think this the confirmation process has helped to inform Mr. Kennedy about, the concerns that people have, and he had to forthrightly address those concerns in an open public hearing under oath. And I think that you're going to see a Secretary of Health and Human Services who will be both pro-vaccine and ask the right questions to make sure that the vaccines are safe, which is the office's obligation as well.
Last week's collision between a US Army Black Hawk helicopter and an American Airlines jet on approach to Washington's Reagan International Airport raised a lot of questions, but while some of the 67 dead passengers and crew were still being retrieved from the icy waters of the Potomac River, President Trump was pointing the finger of blame, although he did start with an admission of sorts.
We do not know what led to this crash, but we have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
Yep, he sure did.
Intellect, talent, the word talent. You have to be talented, naturally talented geniuses. You can't have regular people doing that job. They won't be able to do it.
So he claimed that lower standards among air traffic controllers was to blame.
The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. And then it says FAA says people with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in, and they can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so.
That is false. Still, Trump wasn't just blaming air traffic controllers.
You had a helicopter that had the ability to stop. I have helicopters. You can stop a helicopter very quickly. It had the ability to go up or down. It had the ability to turn, and the turn it made was not the correct turn, obviously. It did somewhat the opposite of what it was told.
It turns out blaming the helicopter pilot was just another way of blaming diversity, equity and inclusion policies, because one of the pilots was female, Captain Rebecca Loback. Gary O'Hara, the father of the helicopter crew member Ryan O'Hara, who also died, had this to say.
I know Ryan respected the people that he flew with and trusted them with his life. And, you don't get to do something in the Army unless you're qualified. You have to earn your spot to be moved into the ladder, to be put into that helicopter. They don't just give it to you, you earn it.
Recently appointed Trump Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy thinks that the Federal Aviation Administration has been too focused on political correctness and not focused enough on safety.
They're having a conversation in the last administration about changing names from cockpit to flight deck, or notice to airmen to notice to air mission, because it's too gender specific. They're focused on social justice and in the environment, racist roads, and EVs. They've lost sight of the mission of this department.
Then Duffy's predecessor as Transport Secretary Pete Buttigieg took to ex-Twitter to make it clear we did not change the rigorous standards for becoming a certified air traffic controller. Meanwhile, back at Trump's press conference, reporters wanted to know how he'd reached his conclusions about DEI being to blame.
Because I have common sense, okay?
Well, Chaz, as we discussed on last Friday's show, it's pretty much unheard of for an American president to speculate and scapegoat in this way, literally hours into an investigation.
Absolutely, and we won't know the answer for weeks, if not months. But I will say this for Trump. He is right that air traffic controllers have been involved in controversies in the past about DEI hiring. Back in 2013, the Obama administration started a new controller hiring system that used a biographical questionnaire to attract more minorities. And at that time, it was criticised by conservative media for making it harder for skilled applicants to get hired. The only problem for Trump, though, is that he left that system in place when he was president, and a lawsuit was filed during his administration. It's due to be heard this year. Trump seems to have sent this whole incident down the memory hole, though.
I changed the Obama standards from very mediocre at best to extraordinary. You remember that. Only the highest aptitude, they have to be the highest intellect and psychologically superior people were allowed to qualify for air traffic controllers.
It's an interesting take, because it was also under Trump that a pilot program was started by the Federal Aviation Authority to help prepare people with disabilities for careers in air traffic operations. And in fact, it was that program that led to some of those disabled controllers that Trump dislikes so much being hired. Also interesting is this insistence on merit being the sole concern for any position. Like when Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth insisted that we need the best and brightest, whether it's in our air traffic control, or whether it's in our generals, or whether it's throughout government. This from one of the objectively least qualified defence secretaries in history. Very interesting. And finally, on this topic, we should note that despite the apparent crippling failures of DEI, somehow America managed to go without a mass fatality air crash for 16 years, until now. Although, to be fair, there have been some near misses, with 19 serious runway incursions in 2023, the most in almost a decade, so we should put that on the record. Look, even though we're going to have no idea what caused this accident for some time, it's possible that this DEI concern might be intended to distract us from talking about other troublesome things, like how in his first week in office, Trump dismissed all of the members of the Federal Aviation Security Advisory Committee, or how on day one, the administrator of the FAA, Michael Whitaker, resigned after repeated demands from Elon Musk that he quit 3 years early, leaving the agency without a Senate-confirmed leader during a major crisis. And why was Musk so insistent? Well, maybe it was because Whitaker wanted to fine Musk's company $600,000 at one point for failing to follow license requirements. I don't know. But never mind. What America had instead was Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy on his first day. Although he might not have been entirely ready for prime time.
I don't want to go into too much detail about the information we have from the FAA, but obviously it is not standard to have aircraft collide. I want to be clear on that.
You can't argue with the man, John.
No, you can see why he got that job.
10 out of 10. Look, of course, no one serious is suggesting that Trump's firings were somehow responsible for this crash a week later, but there's still an awkward topic for Trump right now. In the meantime, we've also been hearing about how Reagan National Airport was a disaster waiting to happen, with 3 intersecting runways as well as military and government operations going on at the same time, making it tricky for pilots to navigate. And yet despite that, the FAA added additional flights last year to Reagan National, despite concerns expressed about congestion and excess capacity. And we've heard a lot about staffing at the aircraft tower being not normal for that time of day, at nearly a third below targeted staff levels. There have been 19 controllers there for ages, when the FAA and the union thought there should be 30, leading to many controllers working 6 days a week and 10 hours a day. And even then, a controller was allowed to leave early during that critical shift the other day, leaving them even shorter staffed. We've also heard about how the Army has suffered 15 serious flight mishaps just last year, and also 2 ground mishaps. So look, there's concerns about the Army's flying and the chopper as well. But the fact is that despite the fact that the passenger jet was flying at 357 feet, somehow the radar said the chopper was flying at 200 feet, even though it clearly wasn't, because they crashed. So that means we might have barely scratched the surface on what went wrong that day, John, and there's a whole lot more than 3 letters.
Yeah, lots of questions, and everyone, including the President, could afford to wait for some real answers. That's it for another trip to Planet America. Do join us for our weekend edition on Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern on ABC News.
And we'll be back here at the same time Wednesday night on ABC TV, and both shows are on ABC, iView, YouTube and Facebook.
Nothing else to plug, Chaz?
No.
Are you entirely sure?
I think so. Yeah, that'll do.
All right, goodbye.